All right, so we'll start with Rita. Anytime you're ready, Rita, we can go ahead with your workshop.
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully I'm sharing the correct screen. All right, so today we are going to be talking about effective communication. I still don't have financial disclosures, and you don't have to worry about this QR code. Um, our goals for today are really to describe the components of effective communication. One of the areas that often communication seems to run amok or go awry is when we're talking about feedback. So I wanted to include a little bit of information on effective feedback, as well as the opportunity to analyze and potentially problem solve any communication challenges you might be having. So, at the core of it, effective communication really is this process of exchanging ideas, thoughts, opinions, knowledge, and data. So, in a way where the message is received by somebody else and understood with clarity and purpose, right? The reason for the actual communication. All right. And so, as you were thinking about communication, particularly with your mentor, obviously it's critically important to establish a cadence for communication, ideally setting an agenda ahead of time so we know what we're going to talk about and we come prepared. If your mentors have any information that you want them to review, you want to make sure they have adequate time to review them. It's not like, please review this 500-page grant and I'll see you tomorrow morning, when it's like 5 p.m. the night before. And I also talk about preferred method of communication. And sometimes there are some generational differences in kind of what people prefer. Some people really prefer chatting over the phone versus Zoom meetings versus text or email. And some people get more out of it, one variation of communication than the other. And then the other thing is to recognize that body language is critically and important. And especially in this day of Zoom, sometimes it's a little bit hard to really read like body language, full emotional expression, etc. But communication is more than half nonverbal. Okay, so maybe somebody's able to hide a little bit better, whether they're irritated with you or annoyed or not understanding. If they're right, either not on screen, you're on the phone, or you can't really see like the full kind of body language. So things like if you notice people are kind of crossing their arms or sitting back, sometimes that means that that's more of like a closed off language of like I'm either thinking about disagreeing with you or I'm not really understanding what you're saying. So those are just some clues to make sure you're looking for. So when we think about what is that actual message that we're sending, so when we look at effective communication, it's critically important to recognize that there's actually multiple steps. It's not quite as easy as me blathering about, words, and then you all receiving it on the other end of this Zoom call going, aha, I know exactly what's going on. So I have to think in my head, what is it that I want to convey? Like what is either the message and or the ask that I have? I have to then encode it into language. Okay. And depending on where I grew up, my English language skills or my just general vocabulary, et cetera, and word choice, that is kind of what words come out of my mouth. Then it has to go through that message or that channel, again, text, email, et cetera. The person on the other side then has to read those words and kind of decode it in their own mind. And then as the receiver, interpret what was said. And so sometimes we can get confused because different words might have different meanings for some people. There might be different context. Okay. And again, we can't always read the emotionality of like, is this like a, hey, Reggie, I just wanted to let you know, blah, 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 blah. Or is it, hey, Reggie, I want to let you know I'm really mad about this, right? Because you can't read the tone in like an email. Okay. So there's all of those things to think about. And the components of effective communication in general are you want it to be clear, concise, correct, complete, and compassionate. Okay. And then we'll go over kind of the feedback pieces and when it goes wrong. Because I'm guessing most of us can do basic communication. Hi, hello, how are you? I'm fine, right? That's not usually where we struggle. So when we talk about being clear and concise, right, it's number one, you got to define your goal. Sometimes people will start talking without necessarily knowing what the destination is. And so sometimes it's really hard to follow, like, what are you trying to tell me? Okay. You also want to know who your audience is and what is their perspective. Are you giving a research presentation to a bunch of otitis media researchers who know all of the lingo, right? Or are you trying to talk to somebody like me who's a general internist and I'm like, I don't know what those like the SP blah 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 receptor or whatever it is that you're talking about, and it's like woo way over my head. Okay. So what language do you need to choose? What is their perspective? Are you trying to persuade somebody to do something? Or are you just kind of relaying information? Okay. You want to outline essentially the information that you want to convey. Ideally, be brief and explicit. Don't try to get people to read between the lines. Again, because that's where miscommunication happens. You want to try to avoid jargons and abbreviations. Again, unless you know for sure, like this is an otitis media research audience, everybody here knows all of the lingo and the abbreviations, then in some of those situations, it's okay to use the words. But, even in the world of like medicine and healthcare, different abbreviations can mean different things to different specialties, right? And then, of course, making sure if it is a written thing, you want to definitely watch your punctuation. There's a big difference between let's eat grandma versus let's eat grandma. Okay. And so, like this cartoon says, punctuation can actually save lives. Okay. You also want to make sure that your message is accurate. If it's written, you definitely want to do the spell check and the grammatical errors. A lot can change if the words, like sometimes I'll read something and I was like, I can't tell. It looks like they were supposed to put the word not in here, right? Based on the rest of the sentence. But then, right, there's a big difference if something is or is not something. And so making sure that what you're saying is actually accurate. Autocorrect sometimes is wonderful, but sometimes it really misses the boat, right? And you can see from these examples on the screen, autocorrect text sometimes falls or fails, right? Versus like grandma is in the grave versus the garage. There's a big difference. Okay. Making sure you know who you're sending it to. And then again, avoid kind of idioms or colloquialisms whenever possible. Okay. Not everybody grew up in the same culture. I personally struggle with things like something is easy. It's either, I still don't know it to this day. There's something with cake and there's one with pie. So it's either as easy as cake or easy as pie. And then the other one's like a piece of cake or a piece of pie. Right. But if you don't have that cultural context, I'd be like, what is this? What does doing something or accomplishing a task have to do with baked goods? Right? I'd be like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so that's an area for potential misunderstanding. Okay. The other thing is you want to make sure that is complete, that they have all of the information that they need to understand, whether it's the context, if there's like a question we're asking, what is the global picture of what's going on? Right? You can't start just midway and be like, so Reggie, yes. And Reggie's like, I don't know, yes or no, because I'm not sure what I'm agreeing to, right? You have to actually give the context for what the situation is. If there are deadlines, you really want to make sure they're clear, okay? And if it is something that is critically important for somebody to understand, we always encourage using what we call a teach back. And this is a tool where you basically say, okay, we had this conversation. Tell me your understanding of what we agreed upon. Okay. If it is critical conversation, like this is like potentially like performance review type of conversation, you also want to make sure that that is well documented of like, this is what we talked about. This is the agreed action items. These are the deadlines for them, et cetera, et cetera. So then there's also that documentation if you need to hold somebody accountable for something. And then again, using those regular teach back sessions and making sure that you have regular follow-up. Okay. So this is how communication goes awry, right? So this is what the customer explained it. The second one is how the project leader understood the swing. So the swing just goes right into the tree and doesn't actually swing. The engineer designed it by cutting the tree in half. Okay, but really what, right? Somebody, how the help desk supported it is they cut down the tree altogether, but really what they wanted was a tire swing. Okay, so critically important. I don't know if you've ever experienced this before where you're like, how could you mess that up? I thought I was pretty clear with what I wanted. But this happens, unfortunately, all the time. Okay. Um, the other thing is compassionate. Our goal is to invite people into conversation, even if there is a conflict, trying to be polite and friendly. That doesn't mean you don't actually engage in the conversation because that also is not effective communication. It just means that we're treating each other with respect and being professional as well as open to other individuals' thoughts and ideas. Okay. So, one place where communication sometimes gets hung up is when we are actually trying to communicate feedback to each other or engaging in a dialogue. And so I just wanted to first point out that there is a difference when we think about feedback. A lot of us actually think about evaluation, which is what we would call summative feedback. Okay. That's the information that's given at the end of a period of time or an activity, right? At the end of this course or at the end of this session, you are going to provide us, hopefully, if you fill out your surveys, some summative feedback that said, did we do well or did we suck at what we did? Okay. And that is really more of an assessment. Okay. And that is very different than formative feedback, which is hopefully some of the conversations that you all are having with your mentors and mentees and colleagues. And that really is focusing on that process toward getting to a product or working to a goal. The idea is that it is given frequently throughout a process as well as needed. And it helps the person receiving the feedback to correct mistakes or change behavior, right? For example, hi, right? Hi, mentor, the feedback, the intervals that we're meeting, this isn't enough for me to feel like I'm making adequate progress in my research work. Would it be possible to meet instead of once a month, meet twice a month, right? So that allows them to change behavior. And it's, again, not necessarily because they're making a mistake, but because what everybody needs is going to be a little bit different. Okay. And so I think sometimes we shy away from feedback because most of the time when we think about feedback, we always think of quote unquote constructive criticism. And that's not really the right way, or it's not, I think, a less productive way, I think, for some of us to think of feedback. For me, this rocket ship model actually works a little bit better. And the idea is that you all have a rocket ship. For you all, it might be your career goals, your research project goals, your life goals, etc. Okay. And in order to get onto that goal, you're going to need to get on a particular trajectory that says, yes, that will get me there. So when you start to go off course, we call that redirecting feedback, what used to be called constructive criticism. Okay. But hey, that's not quite on target. Maybe if you just make this little adjustment, that might get us back on track. Okay. You have to balance that with what we call reinforcing feedback. So saying, like, hey, what you're doing right here, this is great. This is going to get you on track. You keep doing this. You keep reading. You keep showing up to the work in progress. You keep asking these questions. I want you to continue doing this. Okay. And so then it becomes a little bit less of this fear of giving people quote unquote negative feedback. It's like, I'm doing all of this so that you can get to your goal. Okay. And again, the principles are that your goal, like your communication, must be explicit and clear. And it really should be identified and defined in advance, ideally in conjunction or collaboration, okay, with the person that you're getting feedback on. Okay. So, for example, you can't just suddenly say, hey, Reggie, you didn't get there. when we never had a conversation about what there is for Reggie to get to. Okay. It's like telling people, oh, you made the wrong turn when you didn't tell them what direction, like what your goal destination is. Okay. The other thing is that it really should be designed to support and provide guidance to the recipient of the feedback. Ideal world, the feedback is actually requested. What are your goals? Right? Paola, what are your goals for getting this, doing this training session? So let me work and that way we can actually give feedback on something you care about. Okay. As opposed to just giving you random feedback about something that you don't care about or you're not working on. At the minimum, potentially permission granted. There are some individuals out there who really never ask for feedback. And so then it's like, can I give you feedback? If that doesn't happen, because we do have a few of those folks as well, then it is in order for you to succeed, I would like to provide you this feedback. And I'm going to go ahead and let's either schedule it or let's do that now. Okay. Again, typically provided to the individual and not in a group, depending on the situation. But for the most part, again, our goal isn't necessarily public embarrassment. And it's really centered around this idea of the growth mindset that we all have the ability to learn and grow. And that's different from the fixed mindset that says kind of like whatever, what you get is what you get. And if, like I know everything I should know already. Okay. The other critical thing is that it really needs to be focused on the behavior and not the individual. Often these end up coming off as potentially like personal attacks as opposed to really focusing on the behavior. And we'll talk about that as well. And lastly, it's critical that it's owned by the sender. So, what does that mean? So, when it's owned by the sender, what it means is that I, as the sender of the feedback, recognize that my worldview, my perspectives, my ideas about what might be like quote unquote right or wrong, or my preferences might impact how I view something. Okay. We all have different styles of doing things. And most of us think like our style is the right style and the best style to do things. And so when people do things that aren't your style, sometimes we provide them feedback of like, that's not how you do it. When in reality, yes, there are going to be right ways and wrong ways, but there also might be some style variations in there that aren't really wrong per se. And so you kind of have to own that. Okay. So for me, like I'm an introvert. And so when people talk are extroverts and they talk a lot, I'm always like, oh my God, they just talk so much, right? But I have to recognize it's not necessarily because they're talking all that much. It's just because as an introvert, talking, tends to make me like feel like overwhelmed by somebody. You know what I mean? Um, and then the components of effective feedback are that they're specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timely, and well-timed. And if you notice, these are actually very similar to what we call SMART goals. Um, because that's right. That's ultimately what you're trying to accomplish when you get somebody effective feedback. Sorry, I'm in a busy clinic setting. Okay. So specific. So again, this is where we're really focusing on the behavior as well as a linkage to how this impacts somebody's ability to reach their goal. Okay. So we get a lot of feedback, right? Oh, that was great. This was a great presentation. And it's nice to get that positive feedback. However, it would be more specific to say what was great about it. Like, what were the components of the presentation? It sounded like they were talking about like how much antibiotics should be used. So it was very helpful to talk about not having to overtreat, otitis media infections, but just keeping the bacterial low. That specific information was very helpful to me. Or they clearly delineated the methods used in their studies, including the strengths and weaknesses of the approach. A lot of our learners get they need to read more. Read more what? Right? Do I need to read science fiction novels? Do I need to read a particular literature? What am I reading, right? And so you need to, again, ideally be more specific about that person only. It appears that you only have a superficial understanding of the different methodology options. When I ask you, you aren't able to elucidate the pros and cons of each methodology. You're not able to necessarily appropriately choose which method is actually going to support the data that you need to gather to move your research forward. Okay, just as some examples. The other thing is that it needs to be measurable. Somebody needs to be able to know when they've improved or not. Okay, and it again should be behaviorally based. We get a lot of feedback sometimes of like, that person's just a jerk. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? You can't just tell somebody stop being a jerk. I mean, you can, but it's not effective. They just get defensive, and you're like, I don't know what that means. So it could be something like, in our last meeting, you interrupted everybody else. I counted 20 times. When you interrupt people, it makes you come off as not caring about their opinion, dismissive, overbearing, whatever, right? Please stop interrupting. Or maybe the next time, can you keep your interruptions to twice in the meeting, right? As that SMART goal. Or like, you're so entitled, or whatever it is. It needs to be something a little bit more specific about like when you make a comment such as, it isn't my problem that they don't have enough to eat. It appears to lack empathy for our learners. Okay. So again, behavioral and relevant to the work that they're doing. Okay. The next is something that's achievable. You have to focus on something that can be changed. So if somebody doesn't have hair, or they're too tall or too short, there's nothing that they can do about it, right? That is just how they are built. So why are we making comments that are completely irrelevant and something that they can't do anything about, right? The idea is that we're trying to actually change behavior so people can get to that goal on that trajectory. Okay. So things that are actually more effective are things like, when you send out documents to review, they often come with multiple grammatical and spelling errors that detract from the content. I'm one of those people, like, I can't edit your paper if I have to do all the spell check and grammar fixing beforehand because it drives me bonkers, right? And I know that about myself. So that's why I put this as an example. Please spell check, click that little editor button and fix everything before you send it to me, right? That they can do. Okay. The other thing is you want it to be relevant. Okay. And again, maybe this doesn't happen in your world, but in my world, we get random comments like, I don't like you because you drive a Prius or you drive a Lamborghini, therefore you're entitled and a horrible leader. And I'm like, what does that have? I don't drive a Lamborghini, so you don't have to worry. That's not about me. Or like, I don't like your hair, or you like to recycle too much. So what? What does that have to do with the job? Okay. Um, Things that are relevant of like, if when you show up late, dot dot dot, right? Like, this is the impact. It show like you miss half the conversation. You're not up to date with all, everything that's going on in the lab. When you roll your eyes, it looks like disrespect to whoever's presenting. Or you can even say like, sometimes I struggle to understand when a decision has been actually made, or if this is just an ongoing discussion. Can we please make a summary statement at the end of like, this has been decided, or this topic is still an active conversation? Okay. And then, of course, timely and well-timed. So feedback should be provided in relative temporal proximity to the behavior. So it's not that helpful to say like, when you said that thing 2 years ago, it really irritated me. And I'm like, that was 2 years ago. What are you going to do about it now? So ideally, relatively close to the time when that actually happened. The other thing we say is well timed, in that it needs to be, you have to pay attention to the circumstances. So if something is like highly emotional or highly charged, you don't have to do it right now. So, I'm a general internist. So, it is not generally a good time to say, like, you your medication overdose killed that patient, that's not a good time to do it, is right after that patient dies, when somebody is like bawling and completely distraught. Okay. It is better to wait and say, a day or two and be like, hey, you know, can we talk? Are you in a headspace where we can actually talk about what happened with that patient? Okay. All right. So my guess is this is probably what most of you are thinking about when we think about effective conversation, is actually, when does it go awry? All right. So some things to think is, when is it going awry? Most of us can kind of get the sense, but sometimes we sense it a little bit too late. Okay. So we tend to sometimes have a visceral reaction to when we're communicating. And so some people engage in what we call a fight or flight response. Okay. So am I going to flight, run away, right? Or am I going to fight as a stress response? Neither of these are necessarily good, but sometimes what you'll notice is silence. Okay. And that could be that other people stop talking, right? We were engaging, la 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 la, and then suddenly somebody stops, and you're just like, okay, what happened here? Okay. So that, believe it or not, is what we would consider a form of communication, kind of like violence in a way, right? So they stop talking, they might mask. People, you know, suddenly, if everybody started off on Zoom and that's the culture and everybody's on camera, and then suddenly everybody went off camera, sometimes that's a sign that something has gone awry. Or they start changing the topic, or not responding at all. Okay. So that's one way you can detect that maybe something's not quite right. The other side is verbal, what we call violence. Okay, so that can be action that or is taken to compel others, potentially towards your point of view. So sometimes this is arguing, attacking, labeling people. This is where some people are talking over others. Sometimes it's interrupting intentionally. Okay. There are a lot of people who interrupt just as part of that dialogue. And again, not all interruptions are necessarily bad, but when it's like excessive, or not allowing people to actually complete their sentence, like repeatedly. Okay. So when we think about communication and feedback, most of the time we are telling ourselves and other people that our goal is to improve team functioning, to improve interpersonal dynamics. We're trying to help other people. We really want to find out the truth, get results, potentially relay information, okay, and try to reach a mutual understanding and understand people's perspectives. However, sometimes what's really kind of under the surface is that we're engaging in a dialogue because we want to be right, or we want to look good or save face, like we don't want to be embarrassed. We want to win an argument. Sometimes people really do want to punish other people. Or again, with the silence, is sometimes people want to avoid conflict or keep the peace. Okay. And sometimes that ends up devolving into what we call non-civil conversations, where we can provoke, intimidate, or win an argument at any cost. Okay. And so that's when some of those silence and violence behaviors can happen. The other challenges that happen when we engage in dialogue is that there might be power dynamics. I, if I'm lower in the hierarchy, I may not feel that I have the power to actually speak up for myself. Or if I'm a positional authority or I have a lot of power, I might feel like it's okay for me to crush everybody else's and suppress dialogue because I am, more powerful than others. Okay. And sometimes it sounds like we've seen that happen before. Okay. It's important to recognize when that communication that started out as dialogue has converted into conflict, and really try to unpack, like, when and why is that happening? Okay. Sometimes it happens when we're trying to clarify our thinking, right? We may have information, but we're not really sure what to make of it or what decisions to come from it. Sometimes we're trying to defend our actions because either we want to be right again, or we want to alleviate some sort of guilt. Okay. Um, Sometimes we're trying to actually solve problems and we have different perspectives. But then sometimes instead of listening to each other and hearing those perspectives, we get into kind of what we call positions versus interest is like, now I'm right. No, this is the right way to do it. No, this is the right way to do it. Right. And then it times to kind of escalate. And then there are actually people out there who just love conflict and they love arguing for the sake of arguing. Okay. And it's like a fun game for them. And I know a few people who are like that, and you're just like, I'm just not going to win that conversation because you are just going to go overboard. Um, all right. The other times that communication can sometimes go awry is again this talk about thinking back to the conversation around implicit bias. Okay, so we all have our different perspectives, values, belief systems, etc. And there's also a social context. Okay, so the environment and the circumstances surrounding a conversation um, impact kind of how we actually, the words we choose and how we um, actually process what's being said. Um, and so we also have to include all of those dynamics. Okay. Are we potentially inadvertently experiencing and or committing microaggressions in what we think we're trying to give as either feedback or engaging in a dialogue? And those are those, verbal environmental slights that tend to communicate a negative attitude towards somebody based on race, culture, gender, beliefs, or other aspect of their identity. And whether it is intentional or unintentional, the impact is still there. Okay. And it can make individuals really uncomfortable, marginalized. It can people feel unvalued. If they occur enough, it can actually lead to depression, change in career choice, and actually performance impacts. Okay. So when you recognize that things are not going the way that we want to, how are we going to manage it? So the first thing we actually encourage is what we call a trauma-informed approach. There is so much trauma out there. There are so many people who are experiencing variations of trauma, whether it be, right, identity related trauma. There's been a lot of not nice things said about a lot of different groups out there. People experience physical trauma, abuse, intimate partner violence, etc. And we just never know what people are experiencing. Okay. So if we use this as the general principle to how we approach those conversations, that can be really helpful. So number one is creating psychological and physical safety. Okay. Working on building trustworthiness and transparency, offering peer support when possible, collaborating like partnership, empowering others. So, not saying you should do this, but here are some options. Which would you like to choose? And then again, being humble and responsive to an individual person's need, recognizing that what might work for one person might be may not work for me, and it may not work for the next person. Okay. And again, remembering that communication starts with us. Remember that social context, right? We might see and hear something, and I'm going to interpret it very differently than Reggie or Paola or Arwa. We're all going to interpret it very differently. When we see something happen, we in our heads, we tell ourselves a story, right? Like if you see me, I don't know, you probably saw me earlier while I was waiting to talk that I was on my phone. Okay. And you could tell yourself a story. Oh my God, Rita is so rude. She's not listening to what that other person is presenting. She just doesn't care, right? She's a horrible person. That could be the story you're telling yourself. Okay. In reality, I'm still in clinic, as you can tell. And so I'm trying to deal with like a the patient care issue, right? Because the patient's actually still here and we're trying to manage all of this. And if you knew that, you would tell yourself a different story of like, hopefully, right? Maybe Rita's not a jerk, right? Maybe Rita's just actually trying to do patient care and manage, and try to be here, make sure she's here on time for her talk at the same time. Okay. Those stories that we tell ourselves give ourselves a feeling about that other person. Rita's good, Rita's bad, right? All the others in between. And then that creates the action. Okay, so if you're interpreting Rita as a jerk, you might be like, roll your eyes at me, ignore what I have to say, shake me down if this was physically like, what are you thinking? Right? Or you'll be like, wow, let me give Rita some grace. Okay. Again, are you thinking about that context of these dialogues? Who has the power and privilege in the situation? How is that used to influence any kind of conversations or decisions? What assumptions are you making? And what assumptions might the other person you're in dialogue with? Okay. And checking yourself and recognizing that they also have a story that they might be telling themselves. Okay. And then as if you're getting into that space where it's kind of getting a little bit more heated, is like, am I actually listening? And what we talk about is, am I listening to respond or am I listening to understand? Because those are two different things. So listening to respond is, I'm going to hear just enough so I can jump in there and attack you or say what I want to say, as opposed to listening to understand of like, let me truly try to understand, somebody else's perspective or what they're trying to say. Okay. We always encourage using I statements, again, to try to communicate needs without escalating conflict, right? Rita, when I see you on the phone in the middle of a webinar, it makes me wonder, it makes me think you might not be interested in the webinar. Is that the case? Right? So you're also pausing and going, I'm not sure. And I'd be like, oh, I'm really sorry. I was actually trying to manage an acute patient issue. I really apologize. I wasn't trying to be a jerk. Okay. The other thing is, you can try to reduce the emotional intensity of a situation, take a pause, acknowledge emotions, offer alternatives or compromise, or collaborate whenever possible. Okay. The other thing is to continue building trust, like we talked about. Again, understanding what your own approach is and what you might be bringing to that conversation, and foster autonomy. Okay. Recognize others as experts in their own lives of what might be good for them or what they might need. And then try to create that environment of respect. Okay. Where we're learning more about each other. Okay. And again, trying to get in that space where we can actually try to hear diverse opinions and contributions so we can actually engage in dialogue. Another strategy for conversation is OARS, and it's called open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. So open-ended questions are simply not making an assumption about anything. And so, tell me what's going on today that will help us collaborate on our shared goals. What would you like to work on today? What would you like feedback on? Or what has worked for you in the past, right? We're not saying, have you thought about A, B, C, or D, right? Well, what's worked for you in your past? What have you considered? Okay. The other part is the affirmations, reflective listening, and summarize. So if they tell you something, wow, that must have been really hard. I'm really amazed that you were able to continue your research, even though this really, really hard thing was going on in your life. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm sorry you had to experience that. Or reflective listening is like, I just want to make sure I understood, right? Did that package of information, did I decode it properly? What I think you're trying to tell me is that you don't like it when I do this. And they can either say, yeah, you're correct, or no, actually, it's that thing that really drives me bonkers, or I like this, I don't want that. Okay. And then again, summarizing, let me just make sure this is where we're at right now in the conversation. Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything important. And then lastly is rolling with resistance. So if you're feeling that kind of pushback, it means that you either might be moving ahead too quickly or you didn't necessarily understand what that other person is thinking is important or needs. Okay, so rather than being like, okay, I have to correct myself, right? I do this unfortunately with my kids. You're just not listening to me, right? Like, oh my God, you're not listening again. I need to take my own breath, right? And okay, I need to pause and be like, okay, you're not listening to it doesn't appear that you're listening to what I'm saying. What is getting in the way here? What's going on with you? Okay. Or is it because my instruction wasn't clear? Or you just don't want to do what I'm asking you to do? Or you'd rather do something else? Help me understand here. Okay. Um, and again, if you keep pushing, like lectures, fear tactics, etc., unfortunately, they actually just increase resistance and people are less likely to actually engage in the conversation. So with the 10 minutes that we have left, I wanted to open it up to you. I just want to make sure that we're responsive to what it is that you need. So I'm just curious from all of you, what communication challenges, if any, are you either experiencing or have you noticed? And I'm going to stop share so I can see all of you. Okay, so, and there's a comment, a Midwest saying, right as rain. I invite anyone not from the Midwest. I don't, what does that mean?
Right as rain.
Yeah.
So it's a saying to someone basically, you're basically telling them like after you've been sick, oh well, you'll be right as rain soon. Basically saying they'll be completely healthy. I have no idea how that deals with rain, how that's right in any context. But when you were talking about that earlier, I was like, oh yeah, there's that one saying that I remember when I grew up that like everyone would say like, oh well, you'll be right as rain soon, and I don't understand at all, but it's a regional like colloquial phrase.
Yeah. And that's where like a lot of the misunderstanding, right? I would probably, if you said that to me, I'd look at you like kind of cross-eyed. I'd be like, huh? But what kind of communication strengths or challenges are you all facing? I don't know if this was helpful at all to what you're actually needing. So,
Can I can I say something?
yeah.
I think in our environment, it's kind of challenging when you have to deal with people from different countries. So in our lab, we have um, people from China, people from India. I'm from Brazil. My PI is from England, and so this is really challenging because for me, maybe something it's not relevant, and for other people might be. And sometimes it's hard for us to see between the lines. So I think
Hmm.
in our in academia, we have this challenge in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. I think when that is the case, I do think it's actually helpful, and I would love to hear everybody else's thoughts as well. I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, which is also saying. Um, but I think it can be helpful to have an intentional conversation about communication styles. So I do a lot of work related to MBTI, and there are some definitely cultural differences. Like again, sometimes, not always, but sometimes individuals who are extroverted, like their idea of engaging in a conversation is to interrupt people. As an introvert, number one, and then as somebody who grew up in a Chinese household where like we are very, like culturally, my family is very stoic. Like you don't talk, period. Right. And some people will be like, oh my gosh, you just don't care. You're not engaged or whatever, but it's more of a cultural personality difference as opposed to that I don't actually want to know what you have to say. And so having that conversation in advance of like, how is it best that we want to communicate with each other? Here's my communication style, right? Some people are like very talky with their hands, and for some people, they're like, oh my God, that's like overwhelming. And so you need to have that conversation. I do this when I get excited. And then people will know, and hopefully then you can kind of at least have that understanding about how to work best with each other. And I don't know if that's responsive.
Yeah, I believe this is a good strategy because yeah, I've seen some situations that someone was trying to engage a conversation and the other person was not responding, and it was interpreted as, oh, you don't care. And
Mm-hmm.
then these two people, they don't like each other
Uh-huh.
based on that. So yeah, I think it's a good strategy.
Yeah. What else? Any other thoughts?
I'm guilty of what you said, Rita. Like, with my husband bringing up things that happened years ago. He really hates that. But I think it's common among married people or those who've been in relationships for a long time.
You're bringing
What-
work home.
It is common, right? Like you did this to me 2 years ago. I can't ever trust. And I'm like, if you didn't bring it, like sometimes you just got to let it go. Because, right, you can't, I mean, you can carry that baggage with you forever, but like, who is that serving? You know?
Yeah, I agree. I like how I think that talks about the story and how, like, maybe changing the story will change the feeling. That is actually very useful. For me, I feel
Hmm.
the challenge is when there is resistance, or I don't know how else to call it. You can call it resistance. Sometimes I feel it's stubbornness. Like I would discuss something and there's just resistance to yeah, sometimes the resistance presents as avoidance of the topic, or sometimes we would agree, but then it, so I don't know, what's your thoughts or any recommendations on how to deal with these situations? Because I feel maybe I'm the ones that is being stubborn now. You know?
Hmm. Yeah, you can't make somebody engage in a conversation they don't want to have. And the question is, if you can create that psychological, most of the time it's either because they're uncomfortable, they don't feel necessarily safe to
Okay.
express their thoughts. Sometimes it's because they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. Um,
Mhm.
and again, everybody has a different style. Um, it can sometimes be helpful to be like, kind of point that out, like note it, like not in a way, like not in a you're not responding, but like more of like, hey, I've noticed like that you don't seem really comfortable engaging in this conversation, and I just kind of wanted to check in of like where is that coming from?
Mm.
Um, I want to make sure like I'm not creating an environment where you're not feeling like that's safe to have that conversation. I really would love to hear your perspective. They may or may not come around, but sometimes there has to be patience,
Okay.
you know.
That makes sense.
Yeah. What else?
Maybe we can ask the mentees if they've come across recently any problems with communication in terms of their mentoring sessions or maybe within their lab space. I mean, it maybe you can just give examples.
Can I just say something? I am
Sure.
from Italy and I am a pediatrician. I really loved the first part with biofilms, but I really loved this part because
It's good,
communication
right?
is something that we do not think about because we have no time to think about communication. So it's just easy to say, okay, do that and say that, and I say that and you do that. So I really enjoy that, and I think that I try to do that with my residents or my colleagues, but sometimes it's just time is not there, and so it's easier not to communicate and just to make things uh, um, uh, apparently more simple. Actually, they are not simple, and you do not communicate. I just wanted to really well share that because time is definitely important to communicate. If you don't have time and you have just to see patients and one patient after a patient and to do administrative works, well, communicate is sometimes is a luxury, at least in our reality. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say the more effective we are in our communication and providing feedback, honestly, it actually makes our work lives so much easier. Right, because there's less. I don't know if you've ever had that situation where you have a communication and then you start to do something and you do all of this work and then you realize like that's not actually what they wanted. You know what I mean? And so when we are more effective with each other, number one, we're generally going to be happier people because there's going to be less conflict. And then again, the work life is actually can be better.
Yes, but for example, in Italy, we never talk about this issue. So I think it was great and it was well, wow, it's strange, but I think we should think about much more. Thank you.